Hola, Georgiana, Dr. Melendez. So nice to have you at the ROAR webinar series. If you give me 1 second, I'm just going to go on our Facebook page and make sure that we are broadcasting.
Sure.
And also, we are going to record in order to also put it on YouTube. So it'll be live on Facebook and it will be recorded for YouTube. Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad you're here. I have to tell you, Georgiana, that I spent the last hour reading your paper and I thought it was great. Honestly, it was fantastic. It resonated. I wanted to just get right into it.
Thank you. That feels good after, the hours that you put into writing stuff like that.
Of course. So one of the things that I want to level set by reading your description on your paper of intersectionality.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
What I have here is intersectionality is an examination of how multiple and ongoing inequalities take shape through the intersection of gender, race, class, and other relations of power.
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to level set. So talk a little bit about your process for the paper first.
So this paper was actually born out of a larger research project, which I hope we can talk about too, which was my dissertation. I was interviewing underrepresented minorities in the Boston area who had a work experience that was in a larger organization and that at some point became entrepreneurs. And so thinking about, was there a connection between their experiences in the workplace and their identity? And how people define identity is different, and you can't typically separate out different parts of your identity. So the thinking about this paper is that you have to look at it intersectionally. So all of our identities, so as a woman, as a Latina, as a person of a certain age, like all the parts of who we are, and how that connects to how people in our workplaces interact with us.
And that's a great definition, because as I initially, this word has been used constantly lately, overused, if you will. But the way it was described in your paper, I loved the level set. I loved that I could relate to what you were talking about. But now let's move towards the women of color, the specific perspective of women of color and your study.
So in this paper, I used a single case study. So I looked at one person's experience, and I chose, of the 30 people that I interviewed, I chose a person who identified as a woman, as an immigrant, as a Black woman, as a mother, as a spouse, and a leader. So she had multiple identities. And particularly her case was interesting because she shared experiences that started from when she entered the workplace all the way through an executive leadership role, multiple executive leadership roles across organizations. And so the idea that these experiences stayed with her, and I know I haven't described those experiences yet, but they stayed with her from entering through exiting and becoming an entrepreneur.
So can you walk us through some of the experiences?
So so this is a pseudonym. So as we try to keep anonymity. So the person in this case study we named Cynthia, or I named Cynthia, but co-authored this paper with Banu Oskazimpan, who is my mentor and advisor, and just taught me a lot in this space and continues to teach me. So we decided to really approach this by sharing her experiences of entering a workplace, knowing when she entered the workplace, there was a lot of, she started in the South, right, of the US. And so there was a lot of experiences with community-based oppression and racism. And so she entered the workplace expecting to have those experiences on some level, but also really expecting people to treat her fairly and having opportunities to move through the ranks. And so she eventually moved to the Northeast and worked in the Northeast area, so and now ultimately the Boston area, and talked about how, she would be looked at up and down for being someone who's ambitious. Like, how dare she have the audacity to be this bold, audacious person? And she moved quickly and young. So she got into leadership roles and into leadership programs from a young age. And she had these experiences that she definitely connected herself in her story to her identity as a young Black woman. And so I try to use the words the person telling their story uses. And so those were the identities that she attached her experiences to. But she experienced it from both the in-group and the out-group, right? So the in-group, meaning people who shared her identity, were not okay with the way that she was moving through the workplace and felt that her being bold and sort of pushing back on negative experiences or calling out inequality was problematic for them, because then it might call attention to them in the workplace, to their experiences. So they weren't really happy with her kind of putting it out there. And then there were the others who were like, who are you to be doing this? And would say stuff to her face. So she talked about the experiences themselves, but from a context of, you know, she was raised to be this really strong, independent person who needed to just kind of push through that, and she did. So she felt very strong about it. She said, you know, but it wasn't like there weren't moments where she like would go in the bathroom and cry, because hard experiences of discrimination can cause that. But you just come back out and you do your best work. So part of doing her best work for her meant that she had to keep track in good detail of her progress on her projects, to demonstrate that not only was she meeting expectations, but often exceeding. And despite doing that, would often see people who didn't do the caliber of work that she was doing get promoted over her.
Promoted. One of the things that I read was that Cynthia recognized that there was a different standard of performance that applied to women of color, a different set of cultural scripts for them to follow. Exactly what you're saying.
So those came out in her stories, right? So she would, you know, she could say the same thing someone else said and it would be perceived differently. She could complete a project or a task and it would not be received forget to invite her to meetings that were important, where important things were being discussed, or bring her in so late in a project that at the point that she was there and could provide really good feedback, it would appear as though she was dismantling all of the good hard work that had been done prior to that moment. That had they brought her in early on in the project, they would have had that feedback early on and it wouldn't undo anything. But it set her up for some hostility.
There was a mention here where there was a project that had it gone out, it would have affected the company's brand. So she obviously spoke about it, they pulled it out, and yet she was still criticized.
Well, there are consequences for that, right? So she had to do it, right? She had to make a decision, do I say something, do I not say something? And there are consequences for her on both sides of that. Not saying something wouldn't have only cost the organization money, it would have cost her internal reputation issues with her supervisor, right? So she should have been able to identify it. So she did and called it out, pushed back, it was pulled, but then the people who were working on it then have a dynamic with her for, you know, having undone something that they felt really good about, even if it was the right thing to do.
This paper, honestly, I think every woman of color, every leader should read it because it resonates. And you mentioned that you interviewed 30 women.
30 people.
30 people. And in your study for both your dissertation and this paper, because this is really a smaller portion of what your dissertation is. For your dissertation, were there any surprises by the interviews?
I mean, I wouldn't say that anything was a true surprise. I think that for some of the people being interviewed, they were surprised at how emotional they were in telling their story. And not everyone was super emotional, but, and if I were to look at the identities of the individuals who were most emotional, it would be the folks who identified as immigrants. and looking back at their experiences and sort of where they are now and sort of this position of strength they're in now, looking back, it's emotional every time you talk about it because it triggers or brings back all of that stuff that you went through. So I think they were surprised at the emotion that it conjured up for them. One of the findings in my dissertation research speaks to the impact of these identity-based experiences on emotional and physical health, right? So mental health and physical health. So, you know, they described, you know, having to enter therapy, feelings of inferiority or stress, or, you know, having things like acid reflux or hypertension issues, needing to go on medication to balance some of that out, starting to feel like maybe their supervisors or their coworkers were right about them. But then once they left that organization and went on their own, realizing actually it wasn't about their capacity or their strength or knowledge, it really was about their experience engaging in that particular workplace. And so,
I'm sorry, Georgiana.
No.
Dr. Melendez, I
could talk about this, like, keep going.
Find that the folks that you interviewed, in particular, particularly the women, did you find that they, what were some of the recurring themes that they had and why they opted out?
You know, gender-based discrimination came up quite a bit. Expectations about how you need to present, both in the way that you dressed for work and in the way that you spoke in meetings, and how you had to pitch yourself. Those are the kinds of things that came up. And speaking about the how you dress for work, there were ranges. So it was like dressing in a way that wouldn't be provocative because you were being perceived as distracting to your male coworkers, and it's not because they were harassing per se, but that you were being coached by other folks to not dress in a way that would distract them, because then the men wouldn't be able to get their job done, or having people actually sexually harass folks, no matter what they wore. So, you know, one of my participants talked about switching from wearing professional clothes to wearing more baggy clothes, because she was getting unwanted attention from a supervisor who then really pushed her to dress a particular way. And to the point where she even like cut her hair to like distract, you know, to not make her hair a thing, because that was something that her supervisor would comment on. There are so many different stories of managing around harassing behavior in the workplace that are about sexualizing women, but also there are some things that, so there were a few who talked about machista behavior and dealing with particular cultural roles for men and women in the Hispanic Latino community, where if a man spoke, then sort of that was the law, you know, so you had to go, and if you pushed against that, then you were a problematic employee. And so you could navigate different cultural environments connected to identity, and being a woman carried extra burden in terms of how you had to present yourself. This one's actually really important too. One of my participants talked about being pregnant, and having heard from a colleague that when she was returning from maternity leave, that one of her project assignments was going to be given to somebody else because the manager assumed that she wouldn't be able to handle it. Didn't check with her, didn't ask her, you know, what her schedule was going to be like, but just assumed that since she was coming back from maternity leave, that she shouldn't get something so important because she wouldn't be able to handle it. But then having another person, a colleague who was a woman who also was a parent, kind of stick up for her and say, actually, she's looking forward to doing this, and you really shouldn't take that opportunity away before even checking with her. Like, that's just not the way to go. So you need to have other people minding your business for you. And these decisions are often made in a vacuum, and you don't see it. It's invisible.
God. So when I think about the paper, I just wrote this, this particular question. What does opting out mean?
Opting out means leaving, making a decision to leave the workplace in its traditional definition. Mhm.
So when they opt out, are they going to other jobs? Are they starting their a new career? What are these women doing once they opt out?
In traditional, the original research around opting out, it was about leaving the workplace.
Okay.
And it's evolved now to look at opting out of traditional workplaces. And so in mine, it is looking at it through, you're leaving a traditional workplace environment and choosing something else.
So in your research,
Mm-hmm.
and again, I'm focusing more on the women.
Mm-hmm.
But when you think about the women that opted out, did most of them go in to become their own employees or entrepreneurs?
So of the 30 individuals that I interviewed, 22 were women, and 17 of them became their own, became entrepreneurs and completely left their organizations. There are two different types of entrepreneurs in my study. One is sort of the exiters, the folks who completely leave and launch their own businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And the others are straddlers, so folks who still work for an organization while they're launching their business. And some never intend to leave their established organization, while others are just kind of doing that while they get their sort of traction around their own business before they leave.
We talked about possible surprises on the study. Were there things that you believed but now had the data to confirm?
It's interesting when I talk about this research with folks, and even with the participants in the research themselves, there really weren't that many surprises. And when you talk to underrepresented minorities or women, the outcomes aren't truly surprising. This is stuff we know. But we hadn't really looked at it in this particular lens before. I think that when you talk to folks who are not members of that community or share these identities, there are lots of surprises in here. And the disconnect is, it comes back to the feedback loop, right? So when anyone leaves an organization, the organization relies on feedback on some level to help them fix anything that might have gone wrong in that particular relationship, right? So there's a lot of research that supports the notion that feedback loops repair lapses in performance. But in order for an organization to pay attention to that particular feedback, it has to have the strength of numbers. A lot of people have to have a similar experience in order for it to shift a practice or to have them go and evaluate whether or not they should make a shift. And if you can explain the one-off, well, that person really left because blah, blah, blah. And I know that person really this, and that. The reason to do a research study like this is to get sort of cumulative data, more stories, because we can always explain the one-off. But then when you start seeing patterns that disparately impact a particular population, it really does tell a different story. So I did this research from a phenomenological approach. I hate that word, it's so hard to pronounce. But the idea being that I'm not asking the organizations to confirm whether or not these were true experiences. I'm asking people, how did you make your decisions? Based on what types of experiences, right? So if someone said that they had an experience that was hostile, connected to their identity, and that's why they left an organization, whether or not the organization agrees with that doesn't change that was that person's perception and they decided to leave as a result, right?
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense.
And one of the things I asked folks is, did you give feedback to the organization when you were leaving? More often than not, the answer was no. And organizations are like, why wouldn't they just tell us? And they say, first of all, Boston's too small. Why would I tell them when I was leaving when they could see it for themselves while I was there? Or I gave feedback while I was there, nothing happened. Or I saw somebody else give feedback and nothing happened. And so I think individuals are paying attention to how leaders respond while they're there. And they're very generous. I think they often say, maybe they don't know what they're seeing. But there are many who said yes.
Now, in the paper, one of the things that came out was, again, we're going to go back to Cynthia because that's the case study that you're focused on this particular paper. But she talks about how relationships are important to her. and keeping and maintaining those relationships. So even after leaving company, she wanted to make sure she had those relationships. So it makes sense to me that you wouldn't provide feedback that would be detrimental to them, because you wanted to maintain relationships.
There's concern around possible retaliation. What was also interesting though is that I asked folks if that was a part of the reason why they didn't give feedback. And then some of them are many years along, like 5-10 years along in their entrepreneurial venture, and asked whether or not that relationship mattered. And it turns out it didn't. But the risk that it could matter is pretty high. And so you don't want to take your chances. In my former role as executive director of Commonwealth Compact, I had an opportunity to talk to lots of CEOs and heads of hiring about the reasons why individuals would leave, or their perception of why they would leave. And very often they would talk about, well, they had other opportunities, basically companies poaching off of each other. They went back to school, family. They would say something that had nothing to do with the performance of the organization itself as a reason for someone leaving. And so that was different than the conversation I would have with the talent that was actually leaving, right? Mm-hmm. So then, we would have these best practice forums and folks would come and I would ask them about, why did you leave? And they would talk about organizational performance and experiences. And I then, even before I was in my doctoral program, would ask them, did you tell the organization? And the answer was consistently no, which led to the question and the need for the research for me. So the disconnect between what employers think is the reason or what they want to believe is the reason and what the individuals who are leaving are saying is huge. And I think that's one of the contributions that the study gives, is that people don't feel safe telling the truth. Mm-hmm. Or even when they do feel safe, it's often in the form of a lawsuit. But not exclusively, things don't change.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, because once you leave a company, I mean, for me, I would think that I would be uncomfortable, placing these particular things in front of them, especially after I left, if I'm looking for another job or consulting opportunities, that I don't want that to come back.
It's also emotional labor. I mean, I think we think about that because we talked about the mental health impact and the physical impact, a physical health impact. You're asking people to tell you about your bad behavior or about their bad experiences. And it's bad enough to go through it, but then to have to teach you why it is bad is an additional burden on the individual. Most often people just want to move on with their lives and they choose entrepreneurship. And many in the study said they choose entrepreneurship because they don't want to have to deal with somebody else having power over their destiny, over their ability to move forward, to thrive in their careers, and to present their best selves. And so entrepreneurship for them offered an opportunity to present their best selves and feel good every day when they get up to go to work.
That totally resonates for me. I've been an entrepreneur more times than I have worked for corporations, and all of what's in the study really resonates. I can't wait.
I'm going to close my window. It's the background noise for you.
You're fine. But let's shift a little bit. I want to talk about your process getting your doctorate. Because I know you share the story. I won't share it for you.
Well, it's interesting. It was not my plan necessarily to go through all the way and go to school. Turns out I love being in school. Don't judge me.
No judgment.
It's actually pretty great because you get to study something you're interested in, right? So for me, I got a job at UMass working with Commonwealth Compact and immediately went and got my master's degree. I got a master's in public affairs at the McCormick Graduate School for Policy and Global Studies, which was awesome. It was teaching me about, how our government works and things we all need to know to kind of even be folks in business in any government. But it kind of gave me that bug, right, of being in school. And then I had a mentor who happened to be chancellor at UMass Boston, Keith Motley, who said, go get your doctorate. This is one of the things you have to do. And I thought, you know, imposter syndrome creeps all in, and am I really smart enough to do something like that? And I didn't really feel like the answer was yes, but I decided to take a class as a non-degree student in the doctoral program I was interested in. And I mean, I often spent time sitting there with my laptop open, taking notes, and my iPad open going, what in the world are they talking about? And feeling like they were speaking a foreign language, which it is its own language. Academic speak is another, but that's what you're learning, right, in the program. And I took a couple of courses that way and applied, and just let them tell me no if I'm not good enough to be in the program. So I didn't think about how long it would take. I did not sit there and think about the magnitude of how it would impact my life. I just said, let me just put one foot in front of the other. And that's how I got through school. They accepted me into the program. I mean, I still felt insecure most of the time. But I feel stronger now the more I'm immersed in it. And also the more that you see that you can have this connection with people around a shared interest. Like this idea of thinking about how our experiences at work are connected to our identity is something that we live, right? So not only is it a contribution to research, it's a contribution to the practice, right? So it helps me, it helps people that I know think about their experiences, and hopefully it helps managers make policy decisions. But school, I mean, my kids went to school with me. I literally was in school for 10 years. So 3 years for my master's degree, a year sort of off. Wasn't really off. I was taking one class as a non-degree student, and then 6 years to finish my degree. And it meant not going to many networking events. It meant, you know, missing birthday parties and things like that. But looking back, I wouldn't really change that. It was hard. But
and you did it.
I loved it.
And you're honestly an inspiration to many of us, myself included, because you have kids, you have a full-time job, you have all these elements that make it more difficult to go to school.
And, you know, it really took an incredibly supportive community to make that happen. I mean, through work, having my supervisors be flexible around class schedules, and having individuals supporting and being willing to read my drafts, my very bad early drafts, to like what hopefully is better over time. People in my family who cooked for me, people who gave me their houses. I know you saw the pictures. They let me do writing weekends on the beach, or like up in Maine on the lake. Like I've had so many wonderful people sort of support this journey. And I feel like we could all do that for each other. If that's something else that we know, if someone's struggling with wanting to go back to school, as a community, we can make that happen for them.
I think that's so important. I know that I have been working on that myself, and it has been particularly difficult. The challenge that I've had has been the writing. I write in a very specific way. I write in a very marketing way. Which means you say a lot of nothing, right?
Well,
you're able to describe things in a way that make it sound different. But academic writing is so different. It's so different. I've yet to kind of wrap myself around that.
It doesn't feel warm and fuzzy, does it?
It does not. It does not.
I'll tell you a quick story. There was a point I almost quit the program, even after having been in the program for 3 years, which, if you know, like how much you give up to be there is a big decision, but I was like truly there. And it had to do with writing. And I feel like, oh, you know, I'm not a terrible writer. How do you get through to a master's program to a PhD program if you're terrible? But I took 2 weeks off of work, a vacation time, to finish writing a 20-page paper, and had to do this presentation. I remember being in front of my class presenting what I had come up with. And it's sort of all this approach of like, just how I write is how I speak. And at the end of the presentation, my faculty member, who shall be named, Banu, love you, she became my advisor. She was like, I don't know how to tell you this, but you're gonna have to start over again. And that was at the end of me, like, I felt great. It was over Thanksgiving. Like, I was so deflated. But she didn't leave me hanging, neither did my classmates. My classmates rallied, they're like, we'll help you. And what happened was that I write like a practitioner. Like I think about how does this apply to how I work? And in a doctoral program, you're really thinking about theory, like how does a process work? What's the theory around this? How does the phenomenon that I'm looking at highlight the features of this theory? And just thinking, like my brain couldn't make the switch. And at some point it did, thank goodness, I made it through.
And you're exactly right. That's what I am struggling with.
Yeah, and it's hard. So, and I think many people are waiting for the right time to do the next thing, whether it's school or launch their business, or they're waiting for a right time. I don't think that there is an ideal right time. I think you either do it or you don't do it. And you find ways to make it happen. And there are sacrifices that you have to make. But look for your helpers. They're out there. Not everyone who launched their own business had a partner to offset the loss of income. You know, not everyone who launched a business had a family who thought this was a good idea. And sometimes you just do it.
Well, Dr. Melendez, it was such a pleasure having you on. Great information. Before we leave, how can people get access to this paper?
Well, it's in press at the moment. So once it's available, I'll post the link. And if there are individuals who really, really want to read it, I can send a PDF copy, but I cannot post it online yet.
Okay, so the best way to get a hold of you is through LinkedIn, yes?
Yes, LinkedIn is great.
Okay, super. Thank you so much, Dr. Melendez, and I will leave with this. Thank you.
Thank you.